invite our next speaker, and we'll have hopefully good discussion from everyone after each of the speakers. Dr. Vince Scappatura, and I think I've introduced Vince earlier on. So welcome, Vince.
Okay, thanks very much, Annette, and I'd like to begin by expressing my gratitude to IPAN and the organisers of this event today. I think it's a very critical and timely moment to be having this public discussion, given the very significant shifts I think are underway in Australia's Defence Force structure and in Australia's alliance with the United States, which in many ways are unprecedented. I think it's very clear that in the lead up to the release of the Defence Strategic Review, which is scheduled to be released early next year, the groundwork is being laid right now for some major changes in the preparation for the prospect of Australia at war. Everyone from Prime Minister Anthony Albanese to Defence Minister Richard Marles to the Director General of AUKUS, Paul Simon, who in a recent and rare public interview flagged in anticipation of the release of the DSR that there are, quote, hard questions that are going to be asked of the nation around our preparedness for conflict, and that we need to, again, quote, psychologically prepare ourselves for more difficult times. And both Marles and Albanese have also flagged increases in defence spending in anticipation of this kind of mobilisation for war. So it's a very critical moment, and what I want to do in my remarks is briefly sketch what I think is shaping up to be a kind of dual role for Australia's Defence Force as it undergoes this restructuring initiative and preparations for conflict in the context of America's broader military build-up against China. And in doing so, I also want to comment on an interesting and novel development, I think, in the way that the alliance is being reconceptualized and may be increasingly presented to the Australian public by parts of the national security elite in Australia and parts of the pro-US alliance lobby. There's an interesting convergence, or I should say the appearance of a convergence between what critics of the alliance have been saying for decades about the problematic nature of Australia's dependence on and integration with US military forces, and defenders and promoters of the alliance, many of which are now also openly advocating for a more self-reliant defence strategy that seemingly prioritises the defence over Australia over a force structure that simply plugs the ADF into a larger US military force for expeditionary combat operations. And so I want to try and unpack what is going on here and explain why this apparent convergence between kind of defenders and critics of the alliance in reality is not a convergence at all. And I want to unpack how this notion of a so-called self-reliant defence of Australia policy in the way that is apparently being operationalised by the ADF is in fact entirely consistent with Australia's integration to America's broader military build-up in preparation for conflict with China, despite that being seemingly contradictory. Okay, so firstly, as I already intimated, one of the most popular and piercing criticisms of the US alliance, and certainly this came out in the People's Inquiry, is that it has resulted in Australia's Defence Force being structured not for the purpose of defending Australia, but rather to essentially plug into US-led coalition operations anywhere in the world, and particularly in the Middle East over the last couple of decades during the War on Terror. And I agree that this criticism is in fact broadly correct. As a result of the pressures to maintain and expand interoperability with US forces, the ADF has in many ways been structured largely as a kind of expeditionary force with very expensive and exquisite niche force projection capabilities that complement US and allied forces, and that make our defence force in effect a kind of adjunct of the US military, and therefore not particularly suited to the defence of Australia. And I think that this, this force projection adjunct role for Australia's Defence Force is likely to expand as a key function of Australia's relationship with the United States, given that, as I'll come to explain in a moment, The US is looking to Australia and other regional allies to augment American capabilities as it operationalizes its preparations for military conflict with China, and in the face of its own kind of capacity constraints. And certainly, the AUKUS agreement and the intended acquisition of nuclear power submarines is a clear demonstration of this. However, with all that said, there is another more novel role that Australia, I think, is gearing up to play as part of America's military build-up against China. And it may even constitute a more significant function than the familiar function of the ADF as a kind of adjunct of the US military. So as I intimated before, this is revealed in this apparent convergence of critics of the alliance on one hand and defenders of the alliance among the national security elite on the other, who are now openly challenging this familiar adjunct role of the ADF. So just to give you an example, Marcus Hellier, he's a well-known defence analyst from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. He's a former senior public servant in the Department of Defence. And he had this to say recently about what the ADF is purpose-built for. I would argue, Hellier says, that the ADF is essentially designed to plug into a coalition, obviously led by the US, and go wherever in the world we think we need to address a threat or issue of the day. And that's the only way I can really make any sense of our existing force structure. He goes on to say that the ADF should be less focused on the away game and instead be structured for operations to defend the Australian continent and its significant air and maritime approaches out to the first island chain, which is the arc from the Solomon Islands to New Guinea and across to the Indonesian archipelago. So that's one example. Another example, Professor John Blaxland, who is or was, I think until recently, head of strategic and defence studies at ANU. He's got a distinguished career in the ADF and intelligence and in government. He had this to say in a recent interview. "We have designed a force to plug and play with the Americans, but that is not what we need for the future. Interoperability with the Americans remains important for sure, but Australia needs to be able to conduct its own operations in the neighbourhood in a self-reliant manner, as well as alongside our neighbours." And he goes on to argue that, again quoting, "the best thing we can do is to make Australia more self-reliant, more resilient, more able to defend its own turf, and collaborate with neighbours to defend our common strategic space." Now, I should say, for those of you who are unfamiliar, think tanks like ASPI and even prominent defence commentators from ANU Strategic and Defence Study Centre aren't typically known for seriously criticising Australia's participation in US wars, or more pointedly, the ADF's role as a kind of adjunct to the US military. And they aren't the only ones among the kind of national security elite milieu who are doing so. There was a recent seminar just a couple of months ago hosted by the Williams Foundation, which is a prominent defence think tank focused on air power and staffed by very senior, retired RAAF officers and chiefs. And this particular seminar had presentations by serving ADF members, but also significantly British Royal Air Force and the US Air Force as well, discussing how allied militaries are now shifting from the legacy wars of the Middle East to 21st century major power high-end conflict scenarios, with China, as the top consideration or pacing threat, as it's called. And with respect to Australia specifically, there was a focus apparently on how to proceed with an apparent reset within the ADF to primarily focus on the defence of Australia as a key theatre of operations. So I think there's an obvious question that arises from all of this, which is, how do we square the circle of Australia, accelerating its integration with US war plans for China, particularly via the ADF's more familiar role as an adjunct of the US military, with this apparent reset of focusing more on the self-reliant direct defence of Australia, which may very well become more prominent, in the release of the DSR, the Defence Strategic Review. Well, to understand that, I think we need to appreciate a little about what US and allied military planning for war with China is going to look like, or is looking like. So traditionally, the US military approach to warfare globally has been to maintain total control and domination over all dimensions of the battle space in every corner of the world. This is otherwise known as full spectrum dominance. With respect to East Asia, this has meant maintaining an offensive posture to project power and maintain control over the air and maritime approaches right up to China's coast, as well as to be able to strike deep within Chinese territory. And US forces are still largely structured and postured for this kind of offensive strategy today. However, because of growing Chinese military power and particularly advances in Chinese long-range precision strike missile systems, it's becoming increasingly untenable for the US military to maintain such a posture. And so all of the armed services in the US military have been grappling with this challenge over recent years of how to operate off China's coast and within the reach of the PLA's most kind of potent so-called anti-access area denial capabilities, or these long-range missile capabilities. And although each service has developed its own kind of unique operational doctrine, the basic principle of all of them is the same. They're restructuring and investing in more kind of agile, lethal military platforms, including their own long-range precision strike weapons that can kind of rapidly disperse more widely around and close to China. Now, if you're familiar with Australia-US joint military exercises like Talisman Sabre or Pitch Black, among many others, you'll know that the ADF has been training with US armed services, and each of these operational concepts designed for war with China. I don't know what role specifically the ADF, would actually play operating alongside the US in these types of military operations off China's coast in the South China Sea. But certainly that familiar adjunct function of the ADF, it's already highly developed. It continues to be developed in joint training exercises and further through initiatives like AUKUS. So, as I mentioned, I think that's certainly one part of Australia's participation in America's ongoing efforts to prepare for war with China in the face of these growing missile capabilities. But the other related part has to do with the fact that America's largest military bases in the region, particularly in Okinawa and South Korea and Guam, are close enough to China that they are now vulnerable to being targeted by Chinese long-range missiles. And this is where the value of the Australian continent lies. Being much further away from China makes Australia an important a forward base of operations for America's force projection capabilities against China. Upgrades to Australian air bases and port facilities to accommodate more US and maritime forces, the B-52 bombers and so on. This entire new arc of militarization across Northern Australia, which Professor Richard Tanter has so eloquently described, is part and parcel of America's intention to use Australia as an important base and maintenance and resupply hub for military operations against China. Now, although Australia is a much safer and defensible location than, say, Okinawa or Guam for hosting US force projection capabilities, we are certainly not invulnerable to attacks by Chinese military forces, and particularly as China's kind of long-range strike capabilities continue to grow. And so in order to protect Australia as a sanctuary of US forces, the ADF needs to develop its own independent and self-reliant capability to defend Australia and its approaches as a priority theatre of operations, given we have now painted this huge target on ourselves. And in fact, the US military, because it faces its own constraints, is also looking to the ADF to take on this independent responsibility of protecting Australia as a forward base of operations so that US forces can concentrate on the fight closer to China. And so this requires not an ADF that serves solely as an adjunct for US far-flung expeditionary operations, but rather an ADF that also has the independent capability to defend Australia and project force to a significant distance out to our north, given Chinese expeditionary forces could one day potentially threaten Australia and US forces based here with these standoff weapons at a greater distance. There's also a recognition in all of this, which has actually been understood from at least the 1970s and puts light to the claim that the alliance is the cornerstone of our defense, that we can't be sure the US will come to our aid or even resupply us with the munitions that we need, given that their priorities in a major regional war with China may very well lie elsewhere. And so this is really the drive behind, I think, Australia's massive investment in a so-called sovereign missile manufacturing capability and long-range strike capability. So just to conclude, I think this is kind of the proper context to understand what is going on when alliance defenders and our own national security elites are now openly advocating for a kind of defense of Australia strategy. Or when Anthony Albanese says, as he recently did, that Australia needs to shift from previous defence thinking based on recent military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan to thinking about how does Australia defend ourselves, and then proceed to argue for rapid investment in missiles and drones and so on. What we are witnessing, I think, is not, as Richard Marles recently said, an Australian force that is transitioning to a porcupine defence strategy, which is essentially a kind of a non-threatening defensive rather than offensive military strategy to ward off a potential aggressor. I think a genuine porcupine strategy may well be an appropriate strategy for the kind of independent defence of Australia. Rather, what I think Australia is kind of turning into, it seems, is potentially a porcupine that, behind its very long barbs, is openly brandishing a massive arsenal of American force projection capabilities directed at China, along with some very potent ADF niche capabilities plugging into that American arsenal. Needless to say, attempting to play both of these roles, part adjunct to the US for offensive joint operations and part self-reliant to protect Australia as a forward operating base of US operations, is going to be very, very expensive and probably not even feasible to do both kind of effectively. Apart from the fact, of course, that's totally unnecessary and totally unwise and undermines Australia's own security. But that, I think, won't necessarily stop our leaders from trying to do it anyway, because they are so wedded to the US alliance. Okay, I'll stop there.